If you're listening to this, then something has already gone wrong. I didn't mean for it to be found. That part matters. I didn't leave this as a warning or a confession or some last attempt at redemption. I left it because the mountains don't let you keep everything. They take pieces. They decide what survives. This is one of the pieces. I tried writing it down the official way first. Reports, timelines, clear language, names and dates and coordinates. I tried to make it sound reasonable. I tried to make it sound like a man who simply followed a lead too far and paid for it with exhaustion and bad judgment. But paper wouldn't hold it. The words kept slipping. The details wouldn't stay still. Every time I got close to the truth, it felt like my pen hesitated, as if even the ink knew it wasn't supposed to go there. So I'm recording this instead. My name doesn't matter anymore. It won't help you. The badge didn't help me either. And that's something I never thought I'd say. I spent most of my life believing that a badge meant order, that it meant lines drawn in the dirt that the world had to respect. The Superstition Mountains don't respect lines. They don't care about jurisdiction. They don't care about intent. They don't care if you go in looking for justice or mercy or just a man who ran when he should have stayed. They only care that you came. I've been a U.S. Marshal long enough to know the difference between fear and imagination. I've chased men across state lines, through cities that never sleep and deserts that pretend they're empty. I've watched people lie with their last breath and tell the truth when they thought no one was listening. What happened out there wasn't panic. It was recognition. From the moment the trail pointed toward the Superstition Mountains, something in me pushed back. Not instinct, not training. Something quieter, something older, like a part of my mind that had already learned this lesson once and didn't survive it intact. Not real, real, not real. That phrase started looping before I ever set foot on the mountain. I didn't know why. I told myself it was stress, lack of sleep, the usual tricks your brain plays when you stare too long at maps and case files. But the thing about repetition is this. Sometimes it isn't a symptom. Sometimes it's preparation. I've been a U.S. Marshal long enough to know when a story doesn't want to be told straight. Long enough to smell a lie before it hits daylight. Long enough to track men who think they can disappear by changing their names, shaving their heads, crossing a county line, and becoming someone the law can't recognize. But the Superstition Mountains don't care what you're called. They don't care what badge you wear, either. You can laugh at the name. Most people do. Superstition. Sounds like something tourists buy on a t-shirt. Sounds like a joke you tell at a bar when you want to sound local. But names get earned. Names get paid for. Some names are bought with blood, but worse than that, some are bought with time, with missing time, with years that vanish the way people do. I was assigned a fugitive, one man, one file, one face, printed in grayscale and stapled to the top of a thin packet. It should have been routine. That's what I told myself. That's what my supervisor said too, like he needed to hear it out loud so it would be true. The fugitive had a record that looked ordinary on paper. Armed robbery, failure to appear, suspected involvement in something that didn't have enough witnesses left to stand up in court. He'd skipped bail and run south, then west. Then the trail faded, the way trails always do. Motel cash payments, burner phones, a cousin's house that hadn't seen him in years. And then a tip came in. A voice on a line that wasn't supposed to be trusted. A half-formed lead from a man who wanted to trade a rumor for leniency. "He's gone into the superstitions," the voice said. I remember smirking. I remember the shape of my own skepticism. How comfortable it felt, like slipping into an old jacket. "Gone hiking?" I asked. The voice made a sound that might have been a laugh, but it didn't carry humor. More like someone coughing up dust. "He's hiding," the voice said. "But not from you." That was the first time the contradiction followed me out loud. The first time it lodged itself behind my ribs and refused to leave. Not real. Real. Not real. I did what lawmen do. I looked at maps. I called local departments. I ran the name through systems that don't tolerate mystery. I checked trailhead cameras and gas station footage. I built timelines. I connected dots. And all of it pointed to a blank patch of land. A place where the map lines looked confident, but the details got shy. A place that seemed to have borders, but no center, no heart, no, here. The locals were polite at first. That's how it always starts. Polite voices, careful smiles. The kind of courtesy people use when they're trying to guide you away from something without explaining why. Folks go missing out there, one deputy told me over coffee. Hikers, kids, a few old-timers. Heat takes 'em. Bad footing. I nodded, because heat is real, and bad footing is real, and people disappear in the desert every year. But he kept looking past me, over my shoulder, like the walls might be listening. And sometimes, he added, quieter, they come back wrong. I watched his mouth shape the words and tried to file them away under small-town talk, under campfire nonsense, under people needing the world to feel bigger and stranger than it is. Still, I asked, wrong how? He shook his head and stood up like the conversation had reached its legal limit. Different, he said. Like they left something behind. I should have walked away then. I should have recognized the warning hidden inside the pauses. But a badge doesn't like hints. A badge likes conclusions. It likes the clean certainty of cuffs, closing around wrists, and I needed to find him. I drove out before sunrise. When the desert still pretends to be gentle. The air was cold enough to feel honest. The kind of cold that lets you forget what the day becomes. The roads narrowed. The signs aged. Cell service flickered, then held on like a stubborn pulse. I stopped once to fill the tank. Inside, a clerk with tired eyes watched me gather supplies. Water. Jerky. Batteries. He noticed the badge clipped at my waist and looked away. You heading up? He asked. Just working, I said. He didn't smile. People always say that, he murmured. Just working. I asked if he'd seen anyone matching the fugitive's description. He leaned closer, not to help, but to lower his voice. You got a map? He asked. Yeah. Doesn't matter, he said. Up there? The mountains, the map. When I walked back outside, the air felt tight. Not hotter, not colder, just tense. Like the space around me had drawn inward. I checked the doors. I checked the radio. I checked my gear. I stood there longer than I needed to, staring toward the dark outline of the range in the distance. The superstitions didn't look like mountains so much as something that had risen too fast and never settled, jagged shapes against a thinning sky. The kind of land that doesn't invite you in and doesn't care if you come anyway. Not real, real, not real. The first time the radio went quiet, I blamed equipment. The second time, when it came back with static and a voice that didn't match dispatch, I blamed interference. The third time, when the noise shaped itself into something that almost sounded like my name, I pulled over and sat with my hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead, careful not to breathe too loud. Because the desert was quiet, not peaceful, waiting. I said my own name out loud, then his. Like saying it would anchor something. Like the mountains needed reminding why I was there. They didn't respond. A mile later, the road curved, the peaks filled the windshield, and the sky began to pale in that slow, indifferent way mornings do. And right there, nailed to a post at the edge of the asphalt, sun-bleached and cracked, was an old warning sign. Its lettering scratched away so many times, it barely said anything at all. Except one word, turn back. And that was the moment I understood something I didn't want to understand. The chase hadn't led me here. Something here had been waiting for me to start chasing. I didn't turn back. I told myself the sign was old. That someone with too much time and too little sense had carved their fear into sun-bleached wood and left it there like a joke. Warnings rot faster than danger does. That's another thing you learn in this line of work. Still, I drove slower after that. The pavement gave up not long after the sign. Asphalt crumbled into gravel. Gravel into dirt. And dirt into something that barely deserved a name. The road narrowed until the tires brushed scrub on either side, branches scratching faint lines along the doors like they were testing the metal. The mountains grew larger without seeming to get closer. Their shapes shifted when I wasn't looking directly at them. Peaks that looked blunt from one angle sharpened when I checked the rear view, ridges folded over each other, hiding what lay behind them. It felt less like approaching a place and more like being allowed deeper into something already surrounding me. I checked the map again. The trailhead should have been obvious. A marked spur, a clearing. Something official enough to reassure me I was still inside a system that recognized order. Instead, I found a patch of ground that looked accidentally empty. No sign, no kiosk, no trail marker, just a break in the brush and a faint line worn into the dirt by boots that didn't leave impressions anymore. I parked and shut off the engine. The quiet settled immediately, heavy and complete. Not the peaceful silence people romanticize about the desert. This was a silence with weight to it, like a held breath. I stood there longer than necessary, one hand resting on the door, listening for something that would explain the feeling crawling up my spine. Wind, birds, insects, anything. There was nothing. Not real. Real, not real. I reminded myself that fear fills empty spaces, that the mind looks for patterns when it's alone too long. I reminded myself I'd walked into worse places with less preparation, but I also noted how quickly the heat came once the sun crested the peaks. It felt abrupt, like a switch flipped. The chill vanished, and the air pressed in close, dry, and sharp in my lungs. I grabbed my pack, locked the vehicle, then unlocked it again to check. Locked it once more. The sound echoed oddly, sharper than it should have been. As I stepped onto the trail, or what passed for one, I noticed how the ground changed under my boots. Firmer than expected. Packed. Almost polished in places, like stone worn smooth by years of passing feet. No fresh footprints. That bothered me more than it should have. If the fugitive had come through recently, there should have been signs. Broken twigs, scuffed dirt, something. Even experienced hikers leave evidence if you know how to look. Here, the trail looked used and unused at the same time. Like it remembered footsteps, but refused to show them. I moved carefully, marking landmarks in my head. A twisted juniper. A split boulder shaped like a jaw. A dry wash cutting across the path. 10 minutes in, I turned around to check my bearings. The vehicle was already gone from sight. I told myself that was normal. Curves in the trail, rising ground, perspective tricks. But when I walked back a few steps, just enough to confirm, I realized the path behind me didn't look the same. The bend was sharper, the scrub thicker. The juniper wasn't where I remembered it. I stood still and let the sensation pass. That was important. Panic escalates. Stillness clarifies. I breathed. I counted. I waited for the desert to settle back into something recognizable. It didn't. Instead, I became aware of how exposed I felt. Not watched exactly. That would have been easier to accept. This was more like being acknowledged. Like the land had noticed me the way you notice a sound without turning your head. I resumed walking. The radio clipped to my shoulder, crackled once, then fell silent again. I adjusted the dial, tapped it lightly. Nothing. No static. No hiss. Just absence. Dispatch, I said anyway. Because silence feels different when you talk into it. No response. I logged the failure mentally. Equipment issue. Terrain interference. Something I could explain later if I had to. The trail narrowed further, funneling me between rock faces that rose higher than they had any right to. Their surfaces were scored with old markings. Not petroglyphs, not symbols I could name. Just lines, scratches, tallies that meant something to whoever made them. I ran my fingers along one as I passed. The stone was warm. Too warm for how little sun it had seen. Not real, real, not real. I started noticing sound again, but not the kind I wanted. A faint shifting ahead of me. Stone on stone. Slow, deliberate. I stopped. The sound stopped too. I waited. Counted breaths. The desert held perfectly still, like it was listening back. When I moved again, The sound resumed, not closer, not farther, just present, matching my pace without echoing it. I told myself it was an animal, javelina, coyote, something big enough to move rock, smart enough to avoid being seen. But animals don't mirror you. They don't wait when you wait. The trail opened into a small basin, bowl-shaped and sunken. The temperature dipped unexpectedly, the air cooler at the bottom, like it had been saved there. In the center stood a cluster of stones, arranged too deliberately to be natural. Not stacked, not carved, just placed. I circled them slowly. There were no bones, no offerings, no obvious sign of ritual, just rocks that didn't belong where they were. And then I noticed something etched into the largest one. A name. Not the Fugitive's. Another name. One I recognized. A Marshal, retired, missing for 12 years. Below it, scratched more shallowly, were other names. Some crossed out, some left untouched. The dates next to them spanned decades. This wasn't a grave. It was a list. I stepped back, heart thudding harder now, and scanned the basin. The walls felt closer than before. The exit narrower. I told myself this was coincidence, that someone with too much time had collected stories and carved them into stone, that names don't mean patterns unless you let them. But my own name rose unbidden in my thoughts, sharp and unwelcome. Not real, real, not real. I turned to leave. That's when I realized the sound I'd been hearing, the slow movement, the patient shifting, wasn't ahead of me anymore. It was behind me, and closer. I didn't spin around. Training kept me still, even as every nerve in my body lit up with the certainty that distance had collapsed without permission. Turning too fast gives fear a shape. It gives it authority. I stayed facing the stones, eyes fixed on the carved names, listening to my own breathing slow against my will. Not real. Real. Not real. I took one step forward instead, toward the far edge of the basin, performing the idea that I hadn't noticed anything change. That whatever had been pacing me had grown bored and wandered off. The ground shifted behind me, not loud, not sudden, just the unmistakable sound of weight settling where it hadn't been before. I spoke without turning. My voice sounded smaller than I expected, thinner, in the open air. "Federal Marshal," I said, "if you're out here, show yourself." The words fell flat. They didn't echo. They didn't carry. Nothing answered. I waited longer than was comfortable. Long enough for the silence to feel deliberate. Long enough for the idea of being ignored to become more unsettling than confrontation. When I finally turned, there was no one there. The basin was empty. The stones were unchanged. The trail entrance yawned where it always had, narrow and darkened by shadow. But the sense of proximity didn't leave. It clung. It stayed just behind my right shoulder, close enough that I found myself leaning slightly away from it without meaning to. I exited the basin and moved upslope, choosing a direction based more on instinct than map. The trail split twice without warning, branching into paths that looked identical in wear and width. I marked one with a strip of cloth from my pack, tied tight around a low branch. 10 minutes later, I passed the same branch again. The cloth was gone. I stopped, backtracked 3 steps, looked up. The branch was bare, smooth where the fabric should have left fibers behind. I stood there, counting heartbeats, forcing logic into the moment. Wrong turn. Similar branch. Fatigue. But when I turned in a slow circle, the landscape didn't resolve. Every direction felt equally unfamiliar, equally wrong. The radio crackled softly. I froze. "Dispatch?" I said immediately, relief sharp enough to hurt. "This is..." Static swallowed the rest. Then a voice came through. Not garbled, not distant. Calm. Too calm. "Say again," the voice said. It wasn't dispatch. I checked the channel. Checked the frequency. My thumb hovered over the transmit button. "Identify yourself," I said. A pause, long enough to feel intentional. Then, "You're farther in than you think." My grip tightened. "Who is this?" Another pause. Longer this time. You won't find him that way, the voice said. I didn't ask who. I didn't need to. How do you know where I am? I demanded. The reply came without hesitation. Because you've already been here. The transmission cut off. I stood there with the radio pressed to my chest, listening to dead air, my thoughts racing in tight circles that refused to open into anything useful. Not real. Real. Not real. I moved again because standing still felt worse. The trail began to descend, winding into a narrow pass where the light thinned and the air cooled. The walls on either side rose steeply, close enough that I could touch both if I stretched my arms out. That was when I noticed the footprints. They were fresh, crisp, clearly defined in a patch of softer dirt. They were mine. Same tread pattern, same wear on the outer heel. Same slight drag on the left boot I'd had since a knee injury years back. They led ahead of me. I followed them despite myself. Or maybe because of myself. There's a particular kind of terror in seeing your own evidence laid out where it shouldn't be. A challenge implied in every step. The footprints ended abruptly at a sheer rock face. No scramble marks, no handholds disturbed, just stone. I stared at it until my eyes hurt, waiting for it to make sense. That's when I heard breathing. Not mine. It came from just around the corner to my left. Slow, even, unconcerned. I edged closer, hand resting on my sidearm, heart hammering now, no longer interested in being quiet. The air felt thick, resistant, like pushing through water. I rounded the corner. Someone stood there. A man, facing away from me. Broad shoulders, dark jacket, same height as the fugitive's file listed. Don't move, I said, voice steady by force alone. He didn't turn. I took another step. Hands where I can see them. Still nothing. Up close, something about him felt wrong, not monstrous, not overt, just slightly out of alignment, like a reflection that lags behind the movement it's meant to mirror. You're done running, I said. That's when he spoke. I never ran, he said quietly. I hid. The voice echoed strangely, overlapping itself by a fraction of a second, like two recordings slightly out of sync. Turn around, I ordered. I tried to leave, he continued, ignoring me. It doesn't let you leave the way you came. I felt cold then, deep and sudden, like the temperature inside me had dropped while the world stayed the same. What are you talking about? I asked. He turned. His face was familiar, not from the file, from memory. From a photograph I'd seen carved into stone less than an hour earlier. The missing Marshal, older than the picture. Thinner, but unmistakable. My hand trembled on the grip of my weapon. That's not possible, I said. He smiled sadly. That's what I said. The air shifted. The light flickered. Not like a shadow passing, but like the scene itself had blinked. And then he was gone. Not vanished, not dissolved, simply absent, as if he had never been there at all. The pass was empty again, the rock face unmarked, the footprints erased. I stood alone, staring at nothing, my thoughts unraveling faster now, threads slipping through my fingers. Not real, real, not real. Somewhere deeper in the mountains, something moved. And this time, it didn't bother hiding the fact that it was waiting for me to follow. I told myself to retreat. That was the sensible response. Encounter an anomaly, disengage, reassess. That's the language they use in training. That's the language that keeps you alive when the world behaves the way it's supposed to. But the word retreat didn't fit the situation. Retreat implies a direction you can identify. A path that remains stable when you turn your back to it. I didn't have that. The trail behind me no longer felt like a way out. It felt like a suggestion, one that could be withdrawn at any moment. So I did what I've always done when certainty failed me. I documented. I took out my notebook and wrote down what I'd seen. Or tried to. The pen hesitated the same way it had back at my desk days earlier. My handwriting slanted, uneven, like my hand didn't quite agree with my thoughts. Encountered male subject. Appearance matches missing Marshal. Location uncertain. Subject vanished. The words looked wrong on the page. flat, insufficient, like labels slapped onto something that refused to stay still long enough to be named. I flipped the page. The next sheet already had writing on it. Not mine. The handwriting was older, tighter, pressed hard into the paper. Dates ran down the margin, coordinates that didn't align with any map I recognized. And my name, written twice. I stared at it until my vision blurred, then snapped the notebook shut and shoved it back into my pack, like the act itself might erase what I'd seen. Not real, real, not real. I started walking again, deeper now, because shallow places had already failed me. The terrain grew harsher, the path less defined. Sunlight fractured through jagged openings overhead, casting shapes that looked deliberate until you tried to focus on them. The heat pressed down in waves, then lifted without warning, leaving pockets of cool air that felt preserved, untouched. I began to notice markers that didn't belong to any trail system. Stones stacked in uneven columns, scratches on tree bark too high to be made by passing hikers, symbols half buried in dust, worn smooth by time or hands or something else entirely. Each one felt less like a warning and more like a record. I wasn't the first to come looking. That realization settled slowly, heavily. A truth that didn't announce itself but took up space all the same. The fugitive's trail reappeared in fragments. A torn scrap of fabric caught on a thorn. An empty water bottle crushed flat, not by heat, but by force. Boot prints that matched the file description perfectly, until they didn't. Until they changed stride. Until they doubled back on themselves. Until they began to overlap with others that were older, deeper, carved into the land rather than pressed into it. I followed them until I realized the mistake. The prints weren't leading me forward. They were leading me around. I passed the same rock formation 3 times before I accepted it. A tall slab split down the center like a broken tooth. Each time, something about it was different. The crack deeper. The shadow longer. The air around it heavier. Time wasn't looping. It was layering. I checked my watch. The hands had stopped. I tapped the face, shook my wrist. Nothing. The sun told a different story. It sat too high for how long I'd been walking. Or too low. I couldn't be sure anymore. I thought about turning back again, about marking my path more aggressively. But the idea felt pointless now, like trying to tag water with chalk. The mountains weren't rearranging themselves randomly. They were responding. That was the thought that finally broke through the fog. Responding to movement, to intent, to pursuit. I slowed my pace, testing the theory. The trails seemed to stabilize slightly. Landmarks held their positions longer. The pressure eased. Just a fraction. When I picked up speed again, the air tightened. The path narrowed. The sense of proximity returned, closer now, no longer content to remain behind me. I stopped completely. The mountains felt closer then than they ever had while I was moving. The silence pressed in, thick and expectant. "You don't want me running," I said aloud, unsure who or what I was speaking to. The words vanished into the space without response. But the feeling shifted. Not approval, not relief. Attention. I continued forward at a measured pace. No longer hunting. No longer chasing. Just walking. That's when I found the camp. It sat in a shallow alcove, shielded from the worst of the sun. A bedroll, folded neatly. A pack leaned against stone. No fire pit, no trash. No sign of struggle. Too clean. The kind of order that suggests someone expecting to return. I searched it carefully. Inside the pack were supplies similar to mine. Water, food, batteries, and a notebook. This one was old, leather-bound, cracked with age. I opened it. The first pages were filled with careful observations, notes about terrain, about sounds, about the way paths seemed to repeat if followed too closely. The handwriting changed halfway through, became erratic, pressed too hard, then too light. Sentences trailed off mid-thought. It doesn't like being followed. You have to stop wanting the end. I flipped faster, heart pounding. Names appeared again. Some familiar, some not. Dates stretched back further than I expected. Decades. More. One entry stood out. Written larger than the rest, the ink nearly tearing through the page. It wears you until you fit. I closed the notebook slowly. The fugitive hadn't been hiding from the law. He'd been learning. And somewhere, deep in the Superstition Mountains, something had decided I was worth the effort too. I didn't take the notebook with me. That decision came from a place deeper than logic. A quiet certainty that some things don't like being moved once they've chosen where to rest. I memorized what I could, the shape of the words, the pressure behind them, then placed it back inside the pack, exactly as I'd found it. As I stepped away from the camp, I felt it immediately. Resistance, not physical, not like pushing against wind or heat. More like the subtle pressure you feel when you try to leave a room where an argument is still unfinished. The air tightened. The silence grew brittle. Not real. Real. Not real. The trail beyond the camp sloped downward into a narrow ravine. The walls leaned inward as I descended, stone closing ranks overhead until the sky became a thin, distant ribbon. Sound behaved strangely there. My footsteps arrived late. My breathing echoed once, then not at all. Halfway down, I heard my radio turn on. I hadn't touched it. Static spilled out first, soft and almost gentle. Then a voice layered itself over the noise. Mine. Say again, it said. I stopped so abruptly my boots slid on gravel. That's not possible, I whispered, though the words felt rehearsed, like something I'd already said before. The radio continued. You're farther in than you think. My stomach dropped. I'd heard that phrase already. Spoken to me. Spoken by me. I reached up and shut the radio off. It kept talking. You don't remember the first time, my voice said calmly. That's normal. I tore the unit from my shoulder and threw it against the rock wall. It hit hard, bounced once, and went silent. For a moment, the ravine felt hollow, empty in a way that rang. Then the sound returned, not from the radio, but from the stone itself. A low vibration, more felt than heard. It traveled through my boots, into my legs, into my chest. The ground wasn't shaking. It was breathing. I backed up slowly, every instinct screaming at me to run, to scramble upward, to put distance between myself and whatever threshold I'd crossed. The ravine shifted, not visibly, not dramatically, but the slope behind me steepened, just enough to make retreat awkward. The walls seemed closer, the ribbon of sky narrower. Not real. Real. Not real. I turned forward again because there was nothing else left to do. The ravine opened abruptly into a wide, circular depression, a bowl of stone smoothed by time into something almost deliberate. In the center stood a single, upright slab, taller than a man, its surface polished to a dull sheen. As I approached, I realized it wasn't polished. It was worn. Hands had passed over it. Many hands. Over years, over lifetimes. Names covered the surface. Hundreds of them. Etched deep, layered atop one another. Some were so old they'd softened into grooves. Others were fresh enough to catch on my fingertips. Lawmen, hikers, locals, outsiders. I scanned until I found it. My name. Cut shallow, recent. My breath left me in a rush I hadn't authorized. No, I said aloud. That's not. A memory surfaced then, sharp and unwanted. Standing here before, not as I was now, but tired. Bleeding from a scrape on my forearm I didn't remember getting. Carving the letters with shaking hands, convinced it was the only way to make something stay. The memory dissolved as quickly as it came, leaving behind a hollow ache. Not real, real, not real. I stumbled back, heart racing. And that's when I noticed the others. Figures standing at the edge of the bowl. Not solid, not transparent. Present in the way reflections are present, dependent on angle, on attention. They didn't move. They watched. Some wore uniforms I recognized. Others wore clothes out of time. Their faces were calm, resigned, familiar in ways I didn't want to name. One stepped forward. The fugitive. He looked thinner than before, less distinct. Like the mountain had started to edit him. "You shouldn't have chased," he said gently. "You ran," I shot back. The words, automatic, brittle. He shook his head. "I followed. Same as you." The figures around him murmured softly, not in voices, but in agreement. I felt something inside me fracture then. Not shatter, just misalign, like a joint slipping. "This place," I said, forcing the words out, "what does it do?" He considered me for a long moment. "It keeps what comes looking," he said finally. "It shapes it. It smooths the sharp edges until it fits." "And if I leave?" I asked. The fugitive smiled, and there was no comfort in it. "You don't leave," he said. The ground pulsed beneath us. The figures at the edge of the bowl began to blur, their outlines softening, blending back into stone and shadow. The fugitive took a step backward, toward the slab. "You can stop fighting it," he said. "That's how it hurts you the least." I lunged forward. My hand passed through empty air. He was gone. The bowl stood empty again, silent, patient. I sagged to my knees, breath coming in short, uneven bursts. The phrase, looping louder now, harder to contain. Not real, real, not real. Somewhere deep beneath the stone, something shifted. And I understood, with a clarity that terrified me, that the mountains weren't breaking reality. They were thinning it, and I was running out of places to stand. I don't know how long I remained in that hollow of stone after the figures vanished. Time had stopped behaving like a straight line long before, but here it felt especially unreliable, as though the mountains had decided that sequence itself was optional. My knees pressed into the cool rock, yet the sensation barely registered. Pain, discomfort, exhaustion, those had dulled into background noise, present, but no longer persuasive. When I finally stood, the act felt ceremonial, like crossing an unmarked threshold. My legs held me, but the movement didn't feel initiated by will alone. It was as if the space around me had adjusted just enough to allow it, accommodating my presence the way water adjusts around a submerged object. That was when the realization took hold, slow and suffocating. The mountains were no longer resisting me. Earlier, every step had felt contested. Trails had narrowed, air had tightened, the land itself had seemed to recoil at my approach. Now the opposite was true. The ground ahead appeared smoother, more navigable. Sharp inclines softened into gradual slopes. Passages opened where there had been walls. The superstitions, which had tested me before, now seemed almost cooperative. Not real, real. Not real. The phrase surfaced again, but it carried less authority than it once had. It sounded tired, repetitive, like a rule I kept invoking long after it had stopped applying. I moved forward carefully, suspicious of the ease. Each step came with the uneasy sense that I was being guided, not physically, but conceptually, as though the land had learned the shape of my intentions and was gently redirecting them, sanding down resistance without asking permission. The feeling of being watched returned, not sharply, not with menace, but with completeness. Not eyes on my back or movement in my periphery. This was deeper than that. It felt as though every part of me was being observed simultaneously, from angles that shouldn't have existed. My posture, my breath, the cadence of my thoughts. I was being evaluated. I passed objects scattered along the way that carried a quiet gravity. A rusted canteen half buried in sand, its strap worn through from years of friction. A torn sleeve caught on stone, the fabric bleached nearly white by the sun. A badge lying face down in a shallow depression, its edges softened, its insignia barely legible. I recognized some of them. Not personally, professionally. These weren't random losses. They were shed. Deliberately or otherwise, they had been left behind as people moved deeper, lighter, more compatible with the land that surrounded them. The thought made me acutely aware of my own weight. Not just the pack on my shoulders or the equipment at my belt, but the invisible weight I'd carried in with me. Language, purpose, certainty, the idea that I was a fixed thing moving through an indifferent landscape, rather than something malleable entering a system that expected adaptation. I stopped walking. The air held steady, neither tightening nor relaxing. Waiting, slowly, deliberately, I set my pack down. The sound it made against the stone felt too loud, too decisive. I half expected the mountains to object. They didn't. I opened it and began removing items one by one. Not in panic, not in haste, but with a strange sense of inevitability. Extra food. Spare batteries. Tools I justified bringing because they might be useful later. Each item left behind brought a subtle sense of relief, like releasing breath I hadn't realized I was holding. That should have frightened me more than it did. By the time I stood again, lighter and unburdened, my movements felt smoother, more natural. The ground no longer resisted my steps. The path ahead seemed obvious in a way it never had before. Not real. Real. Not real. The phrase echoed faintly. But I was no longer sure which side of it I stood on. The landscape ahead narrowed into a familiar configuration. A long, winding pass, bordered by stone walls, that rose higher the farther in I went. I recognized it instantly. Not from this journey, but from something deeper and more disorienting. Memory. I had been here before. Not today, not yesterday, but long enough ago that the recollection carried a dreamlike quality, edges blurred by time and denial. I remembered running through this pass, breath ragged, heart pounding, driven not by pursuit but by dread. I remembered stumbling, skin breaking against stone, the sharp sting of blood. I remembered stopping. I remembered carving my name. The memory overlapped with the present so completely that I staggered, reaching out to steady myself against the rock wall. The stone beneath my palm was warm, almost familiar, as if it recognized the contact. This wasn't my first time in the Superstition Mountains. It was my return. The understanding hit me with a force that stole my breath. I hadn't been lured here by a fugitive. I hadn't followed a trail into unknown territory. I had resumed something unfinished. You came back. The voice was calm, measured, and close. I turned slowly. The missing Marshal stood a few steps away, clearer now than before, more solid, more present. He looked older than the photograph I remembered, but not by much. Time had touched him lightly here, as though the mountains had preserved him at a stage they found acceptable. You didn't finish last time, he continued, his tone devoid of accusation. What do you mean? I asked, though my chest tightened with the weight of an answer I didn't want. He gestured vaguely around us, encompassing the stone walls, the narrowing sky, the path that seemed to curve endlessly forward. You learned how it worked, he said. You learned how to move without angering it. But you couldn't let go of who you thought you were. I'm still who I am, I said. The words, defensive, reflexive. He studied me with something like sympathy. That's the problem. The air shifted subtly, not in temperature but in pressure, like the space itself was leaning in to listen. I felt suddenly exposed, every thought too loud, every memory too close to the surface. What happens if I don't let it change me? I asked. The Marshal didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter. Then it breaks you, he said. And you? I asked. What did it do to you? He smiled faintly, and there was sadness in it, unhidden and unguarded. I stayed long enough to forget which parts were mine to begin with. The path ahead darkened slightly, the stone walls drawing closer, the sky thinning into a narrow strip of pale light. I felt the choice approaching not as a decision I could debate, but as a narrowing of possibilities. Doors closing softly, one by one. I realized then that the Superstition Mountains weren't interested in my fear, my guilt, or even my survival. They were interested in my identity, and they were very close to deciding how much of it I was allowed to keep. The missing Marshal watched me the way a man watches a storm he knows he can't outrun, not with fear, not with urgency, but with the calm resignation of someone who has already learned the limits of resistance. There was no tension in his posture, no readiness to flee or fight. He stood as though the mountains themselves had decided his outline was acceptable and stopped pressing against it. I became aware of my breathing again, not because it was strained, but because it felt optional. The air moved in and out of my lungs, without urgency, without consequence. I had the unsettling sense that if I stopped, nothing immediate would happen. No panic. No collapse. Just continuation in another form. That frightened me more than suffocation ever could. "You stayed," I said at last, my voice sounding distant even to me. "You could have fought harder. You could have kept moving." He nodded slowly, as though I were reciting something he'd once said himself, word for word, to someone who hadn't listened either. "I did keep moving," he replied. "For a long time. Long enough that days stopped meaning anything. Long enough that the idea of leaving became abstract." He turned and began walking deeper into the pass. I followed, not because I chose to, but because the space behind me felt thinner, less stable, as though retreat required more effort than advance. "That's how it convinces you," he continued. "It doesn't trap you. It acclimates you. You think you're surviving because you're adapting. You think learning the patterns means you're winning." The stone walls rose higher as we walked, their surfaces worn smooth in places, scarred deeply in others. I noticed, with a tightening in my chest, that his boots still made no sound. The ground accepted him completely, without record. "The patterns aren't the trap," he said. "Familiarity is. Not real. Real. Not real." The phrase surfaced again, but now it felt hollow, like a charm rubbed smooth from overuse. It had once been a boundary, a way to keep experience, divided into safe categories. Now, it was just noise. We emerged onto a wide stone shelf that felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. Not unnatural, too intentional. Pillars rose around the perimeter, eroded into shapes that suggested arches without ever fully committing to them. Light filtered down in narrow beams from cracks high above, illuminating the ground in isolated patches, as though the place itself were selecting what deserved to be seen. I knew without being told that this was a center, not a geographic one, something conceptual. A place where movement slowed and decisions lost their privacy. The missing Marshal stepped aside, allowing me to see what lay ahead. The ground was marked with impressions, not footprints, but something closer to casts. The suggestion of human form pressed faintly into stone. Some were complete enough to recognize limbs, torsos, the curve of a head. Others were partial, fragmented, as if the process had been interrupted or abandoned halfway through. They overlapped, layered, accumulated. I felt a hollow ache open in my chest as understanding settled in. "This is where it finishes," I said quietly. He shook his head. "No, this is where it stops asking." I thought of the names carved into stone, of my own name appearing before I remembered carving it, of the notebook I hadn't written in yet, but somehow recognized as mine. "This place records us," I said. "Not actions," he replied. "Essence. The way pressure records itself in rock." The air felt heavier here, not oppressive, but dense with attention. I had the overwhelming sensation of being measured from the inside out, every contradiction noted, every attachment weighed. I became painfully aware of the badge at my belt. Its weight had increased without explanation, pulling insistently, like gravity localized to a single point. The metal felt colder than the surrounding air, dense with meaning, dense with memory. Every promise it represented, every boundary it enforced, every identity it helped me perform. "What happens if I don't let it take that?" I asked. The missing Marshal didn't answer immediately. His gaze shifted to the impressions in the stone, to the places where forms had blended so thoroughly they were indistinguishable. "Then it takes what's holding on to it," he said finally. "It starts with your certainty, then your urgency, then your sense of before and after." The ground pulsed faintly beneath us, not violently, not as a warning, more like a steady, patient rhythm, something vast operating on a timescale where resistance was just another texture to be worn smooth. I understood then that the mountains weren't predators, they were archivists. They didn't chase, they didn't lure, they didn't punish, they preserved. They waited for people who arrived with sharp definitions and watched as those definitions softened, blurred, and eventually dissolved into something that fit. I unclipped the badge slowly. The sound it made felt final in a way words never could. I held it in my palm for a long moment, feeling its cold weight, the familiar shape pressed into my skin. Not real. Real. Not real. The phrase collapsed entirely, meaningless now. There was no line left to stand on. When I set the badge on the stone, relief washed through me so abruptly I nearly staggered. Not joy, not peace. Alignment. The air shifted, easing around me. The pressure receded. The mountains seemed to exhale, a deep, ancient release that vibrated through the shelf beneath our feet. The missing Marshal watched with quiet approval. "That's not surrender," he said. "That's how it starts making room." I felt lighter, not physically, but fundamentally, as though something rigid inside me had finally loosened. My thoughts flowed more smoothly. The edges of fear dulled. The urgency that had driven me here felt distant, almost irrelevant. And beneath that relief, something else stirred. Something patient, something expansive. I realized, with a clarity that chilled me far more than fear ever had, that the mountains hadn't been waiting for my panic or my guilt. They had been waiting for my understanding. And now that they had it, there was nothing left to argue with. Nothing left to chase. Nothing left but to remain. I don't know how long it's been since I stopped walking. Time never came back the way I expected it to. It didn't snap into place or resume its old habits. It simply loosened, spread out, became something wide enough to stand inside without noticing its edges. Days may have passed, or minutes, or nothing measurable at all. I know this much. I am no longer lost. That's the word that used to frighten me most, the one that echoed through my thoughts when the trails repeated and the landmarks shifted and the maps failed to agree with themselves. Lost implied panic. Lost implied error. Lost meant there was a correct location somewhere else, a version of events where I had made better choices and everything lined up again. That version doesn't exist anymore. The mountains taught me that gently, the way you teach someone who keeps hurting themselves by insisting on the wrong question. I still move sometimes. Not with urgency, not with intent. I move the way water moves through stone, following spaces that open without being forced. The land accommodates me now, not as a guest, not as a captive, as something recognized. I've tried, more than once, to remember why I came here in the first place. The fugitive. The case number. The photograph. Stapled to the top of a thin file. Those details still exist, but they feel decorative now, like props from a story that needed an excuse to begin. The chase didn't matter. It was never about him, or me, or the law. It was about attention, about arriving with edges sharp enough to catch. I understand now why people say the Superstition Mountains take you. It's easier than explaining the truth. Easier than admitting that nothing is taken by force. That people arrive, already carrying too much, already strained by definitions they refuse to loosen. The mountains don't take, they wait. I've found places where others stopped, the way you find shallow impressions in sand long after the tide has gone out. Not bodies, not remains. Just the suggestion that someone once stood here long enough to leave an outline behind. Some of those outlines feel familiar. Some feel like future tense. Every so often, I come across something new. A scrap of fabric, a tool, a notebook, with blank pages that don't stay blank for long. I don't take them with me. I've learned better than that. Things belong where they are found here. Movement is selective. Possession is temporary. Identity, even more so. I think about the badge sometimes, not with longing, not with regret, just recognition. It served its purpose. It shaped me into something that could arrive here intact enough to be noticed. That was always its final job. There are moments, rare ones, when the old reflex tries to surface. When I hear something that sounds like footsteps arranged with intent, or voices layered just enough to resemble language, in those moments the phrase stirs again, faint and automatic. Not real. Real. Not real. It doesn't do much anymore. Reality here doesn't need defending. It doesn't argue. It doesn't assert itself. It simply persists, patient and expansive, waiting for you to stop insisting on borders. I've thought about leaving a warning, something clear, something sharp, something that would make sense to someone standing where I once stood, staring at a sign, with the lettering scratched almost completely away. Turn back. But warnings assume distance. They assume choice. If you're close enough to hear this, if you're close enough that these words feel less like a story and more like a pressure behind your eyes, then you already know how this works. You wouldn't be listening otherwise. Curiosity is the first step. Recognition is the second. After that, the path narrows on its own. I'm recording this now not because I expect to be understood, but because things like this have a way of resurfacing, of finding ears that resonate at the right frequency. The mountains don't erase everything. They curate. They let pieces go. Maybe this is one of those pieces. Maybe you'll listen and feel a tightening in your chest you can't quite explain. Maybe you'll dismiss it. Tell yourself it's atmosphere, good storytelling, coincidence. That's fine. Dismissal is just another way of circling the edge. I won't tell you where I am. Directions don't translate anymore. The landmarks shift for everyone. What matters is not where the Superstition Mountains begin, but when they begin paying attention to you, and they will. They always do. So if, someday soon, you find yourself staring at a map that refuses to settle, or standing at a trailhead that feels accidentally empty, or hearing your own name carried on air that has no reason to know it, remember this: you weren't led there. You arrived. And if you're hearing this at all, then somewhere behind the silence, something has already noticed you. You don't believe me. That's all right. You will.